Hi everyone, and welcome back to Minds and Machines with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. So last time we took a look at Rene Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, and we spent most of our time just looking at the important bits from the first two meditations. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about some of the ideas we find in Meditations 3 and 6. In particular, this material will pertain to Descartes' arguments for the existence of God, because as we'll see, God is kind of like the guarantor of knowledge for Descartes. We'll look at some of the problems he introduced, the problem of other minds and the mind-body problem. We'll take a look at some responses to these problems, and then we'll wrap everything up. So, yeah. We're also not going to go as deep into the material. We're not going to do as much of the close reading kind of thing that I did last time. And I think we'll begin with a little bit of recap of the important ideas that we covered from the first two meditations. So let's do a little bit of recap now before we move on to talk about the problem of other minds and the mind-body problem. So last time we saw that Descartes is using a methodological doubt, or a systematic doubt, if you like, to doubt everything, all of his beliefs, even beliefs he thinks he can be certain about. If he can find just one small reason to doubt them, then he has to treat them as if they were false. And in this way, Descartes wants to sort of tear down his knowledge from the foundations and build it back up again. Once he's identified something that he can know with certainty, right? Once he finds a secure foundation to start building his knowledge back up again upon. Yes. So, of course, we saw last time that Descartes begins by doubting knowledge from his senses. So knowledge for Descartes does not come from sense experience. The senses can deceive us. Even if the senses only deceive us every once in a while, Descartes says, that is ample enough reason not to trust the knowledge we get from our senses. And that doesn't just apply to mistaking objects in the distance for other objects or something like that, right? It also includes perceptual knowledge, like, this belief I form based on looking at myself that I have these hands and a body and that I'm sitting right here by my light of reason lecturing to you. Descartes says that for all he knows, he could be just dreaming that he's sitting by the fire, talking about philosophy. So for all he knows, he could be dreaming. You could be dreaming right now. I could be dreaming. How could we tell for certain? Descartes isn't very certain how he could tell, so he has to doubt that he has a body, as well as all this other knowledge that he's getting from his senses. He even applies his methodological doubt to God and to the certainties of mathematics. Descartes doesn't think that God is a deceiver, but since God is all-powerful, if he wanted to, he could certainly deceive Descartes about certain knowledge. Like, for example, that 2 + 2 = 4. He could deceive Descartes about that if he wanted to. Descartes doesn't want to argue that God would do that, though, because God is supposed to be benevolent, right? So he says, well, there could be this evil genius or this evil demon who's absolutely malevolent and all-powerful and who wants to deceive me in the same kind of way. Descartes, if he were being deceived that way, wouldn't know he was being deceived. So he can doubt even the certainties of mathematics, because an evil genius or, God, if he wanted to, could make Descartes believe that 2 + 2 = 5, or that triangles have 4 sides, or something like that, right? But as we saw last time, Descartes does eventually arrive at a sort of epistemological foundation that he thinks is indubitable. He points out towards the end of the second meditation that so long as he is continuing to doubt, or as long as he's being deceived by this evil genius, evil demon character, he can still be certain of one thing, and that is that he exists. Because if there is someone being deceived, or there is someone doing the doubting, well, that someone must exist, according to Descartes. So, whenever he thinks it, whenever he utters this proposition, I am, I exist, he thinks that must be true. It is necessarily true every time he says it or thinks it in his mind. And that's become known as the cogito, from cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for I think, therefore I am. It's given in Latin, I believe, in the Meditations. In the earlier published Discourses on the Method, I believe it was given in French. So that's je pense, donc je suis. I think, therefore I am. And that's just become known as the cogito, one of the most famous passages in Western philosophy. I think, therefore I am. Now, Descartes found something he can know, he says, with certainty. He exists. But his understanding of himself here is still quite limited, right? He's a thinking thing. He has a body, and we'll talk about the body a little bit more later. But as I mentioned last time, the body is, for Descartes, a machine. It's a machine made by God or produced by nature. It's like an automaton, a natural automaton. So the body's a machine for Descartes. But he is not his body. What he is most essentially, that spark or that core self, that thing that Descartes is a thinking thing, right? A res cogitans. He's a soul, and the soul has intellect or mind, and it gets its existence or its reality from God. That's what Descartes argues in the rest of the Meditations, right? So the body's an extended thing, but really what Descartes is his thinking self, his soul, right? Which, again, created in the image and likeness of God, he would have argued. And the body's an extended thing, and we can know about bodies, but we don't really come to learn about them via the senses, Descartes argued, as we saw last time. It is the mind that perceives how things really are, right? It is the mind, it is the intellect, it's not the senses. And this was the point of the wax exercise, right, that Descartes does in meditation number 2. He has this piece of beeswax and he compares its states, right? He talks about what it's like in a solid state versus a liquid state. When it's solid, it's cold, it smells a little bit like the flowers, it's kind of waxy, it makes a noise when he hits it. But when it's melted, it increases, it expands, it becomes liquid, it loses its smell, it doesn't make a sound if you touch it anymore. You can't really touch it because it's hot. So the wax might be mistaken for different substances, if you didn't inspect it with your intellect. But Descartes inspects it with his intellect and concludes that all these things, its solidness or its aroma or whatever, that he might have thought were essential to the wax, were he to rely specifically on his senses, are not anything to do with what the wax is. The wax is just an extended substance. It's matter, whether it's solid or liquid. And it's the mind or the intellect that really grasps the nature of the wax. So it's his understanding, not the saxes. It's his understanding, not his senses, that allows him to understand that what the wax is. The wax is an extended substance, and the solid wax and the molten wax are indeed the same substance. So that's the point of the wax exercise. Now, that's about enough for the recap, I think. I think what we'll do now is move on to talk about the problem of other minds. Now, as I said, Descartes has a certain bit of knowledge he thinks is pretty indubitable. I am, I exist. He's a thinking thing. But that's pretty limited. There's a worry that comes with this limited understanding of what he is. And that worry is solipsism and the problem of other minds. So that is what we will take a look at now. Okay, so solipsism. What is solipsism? Well, solipsism is the belief that your own mind and the contents of your mind are the only things that you can know for certain exist. So, is Descartes a solipsist? No, not really, but I suppose there's a worry that he might be read this way, that the cogito kind of means the only thing he can know for certain is that he exists and that he is a thinking thing and so on and so forth, right? And this is related to the problem of other minds. I mean, say you're not a solipsist. A solipsist would say that he or she can only know that their own mind exists. If you're not a solipsist, maybe you do believe other minds besides your own exist, but how do you know that? What is your justification for believing that there are other minds beside your own? So, solipsism and the problem of other minds are related, but they are different as well. Okay, solipsism is a belief. The problem of other minds is an epistemological problem, right? So Descartes needs to reason his way out of this solipsism. He is not a solipsist, right? He wants to be certain of more than just the cogito, that he is a thinking thing. So what does he do to get out of this? Well, in the Meditations, he does a few things to deal with solipsism. He appeals primarily to God and his clear and distinct ideas to be certain about more than just the cogito. And elsewhere, in his earlier published Discourses on the Method, he offers an interesting solution to the problem of other minds when he talks about the difference between humans and animals. So we'll take a look at that, and you can take a look at the Discourses. This part that we'll look at is in part 5. I've linked it on See You Learn if you all want to take a look. But let's take a look at the ways that Descartes deals with solipsism in the Meditation. So how does he address these worries? Well, in Meditation 3, he argues that there exists a benevolent God, a benevolent meaning all good, all-powerful God, who would not deceive him like his so-called evil genius would. And Descartes offers a lot of different arguments. He kind of sprinkles lots of different arguments for the existence of God throughout the Meditations, particularly Meditations 3 and 6. I'm going to just take a look at some stuff from Meditation 3 here, and I'm going to read a passage just to give you a sense of the kind of thing Descartes is doing here. So, in Meditation 3, Descartes says, "Now it is obvious by the natural light," the natural light of reason, a big rationalist theme, okay? This natural light of reason is this, well, it's reason. It's for Descartes, your God-given reason, what allows you to see the truth, right? So kind of like logos in the ancient Greek tradition. So it is obvious by the natural light that the total cause of something must contain at least as much reality as does the effect. For where could the effect get its reality from, if not from the cause? And how could the cause give reality to the effect it first had, that reality could, excuse me. And how could the cause give reality to the effect unless it first had that reality itself? Two things follow from this: that something can't arise from nothing, and that what is more perfect, that is, contains in itself more reality, can't arise from what is less perfect. And this is plainly true not only for actual or intrinsic reality, as philosophers call it, but also for the representative reality of ideas. That is, the reality that an idea represents. A stone, for example, can begin to exist only if it is produced by something that contains, either straightforwardly or in some higher form, everything that is to be found in the stone. Similarly, heat can't be produced in a previously cold object except by something of at least the same order of perfection as heat, and so on. I don't say simply except by something that is hot, because that is not necessary. The thing could be caused to be hot by something that doesn't itself straightforwardly contain heat. That is, that isn't itself hot, but contains heat in a higher form. That is something of a higher order of perfection than heat. For example, although God is obviously not himself hot, he can cause something to be hot because he contains heat, not straightforwardly, but in a higher form. Wow, that was one heck of a parenthesis there. Descartes continues, But it is also true that the idea of heat or of a stone can be caused in me only by something that contains at least as much reality as I conceive to be in the heat or in the stone. For although this cause does not transfer any of its actual or intrinsic reality to my idea, it still can't be less real. An idea need have no intrinsic reality except what it derives from my thought, of which it is a mode. But any idea that has representative reality must surely come from a cause that contains at least as much intrinsic reality as there is representative reality in the idea. For if we suppose that an idea contains something that was not in its cause, it must have got this from nothing. Yet the kind of reality that is involved in something's being represented in the mind by an idea, though it may not be very perfect, certainly isn't nothing, and so it can't come from nothing. As I said, Descartes says a lot more than this, and there's a lot here just in these couple of paragraphs. But he's offering a lot of classic arguments for the existence of God. You know, something can't come from nothing, and in that something can't come from nothing, he's talking about creation, but he's also talking about ideas in the mind. Where do we get our ideas from? He says this. He also offers ontological arguments for God. So if you're familiar with like St. Anselm's ontological argument, Descartes offers something very similar to that, where God necessarily exists. You know, I'm not going to go into details here, but, you know, imagine a being greater than which nothing can be conceived. Well, that being must necessarily exist, because if it didn't, it wouldn't be greater than anything else which can be conceived. So God, being the most infinitely great being, must exist, right? That's kind of the basic idea. Descartes offers a similar argument to that. So Descartes needs to establish that there is a God, because God is the guarantor of his clear and distinct ideas. Indeed, Descartes thinks clear and distinct ideas are the only ideas upon which a thinking person should rely if he or she is looking for certainty. He says, "Now I will look more carefully to see whether I have overlooked other facts about myself. I am certain that I am a thinking thing. Doesn't that tell me what it takes for me to be certain about anything? In this first item of knowledge, there is simply a clear and distinct perception of what I am asserting. This wouldn't be enough to make me certain of its truth if it could never turn out that something I perceived so clearly and distinctly was false. So I now seem to be able to lay it down as a general rule that whatever I perceive very clearly and distinctly is true." And remember, when we're talking about perceiving clear and distinct ideas, we're not talking about sense perception, right? We're talking about grasping with the intellect or with the mind, you know, by the natural light of reason. Now, Descartes goes even further. Descartes got a clear and distinct idea of God. You know, he's not just applying to all or appealing to these ontological arguments for the existence of God, saying that God must necessarily exist. He also says, well, I have a clear and distinct idea of God, so I can be pretty sure that God exists, because if there's a clear and distinct idea in my understanding, that's reliable, epistemologically speaking. So the subject of his clear and distinct ideas, Descartes argues, must really exist. And he has a clear and distinct idea of God, so God must exist. He writes, "So there remains only the idea of God. Is there anything in that which couldn't have originated in myself? By the word God, I understand a substance that is infinite, eternal, unchangeable, independent, supremely intelligent, supremely powerful, which created myself and anything else that may exist. The more carefully I concentrate on these attributes, the less possible it seems that any of them could have originated from me alone. So this whole discussion implies that God necessarily exists. It is true that my being a substance explains my having the idea of substance, but it does not explain my having the idea of an infinite substance. That must come from substance that is itself infinite. I am finite." So Descartes got this clear and distinct idea of God, and that idea could not have come from himself, he is saying here, because Descartes is imperfect, and God is supposed to be perfect and infinite and supremely powerful. So how could this, imperfect being like Descartes conceive of this perfect being? This idea of this perfect being must come from God itself. It couldn't have come from Descartes. He couldn't have just made it up. So God must necessarily exist. Again, we're not really going to go into the details of the ontological argument from St. Anselm here, but this is very similar to that. Again, I'll link an article perhaps in the video description to something that talks about Anselm's ontological argument, just a Wikipedia article or something for those of you who are not familiar. But what Descartes is doing here is very similar to what St. Anselm did many years earlier with his ontological argument for the existence of God. So Descartes is arguing that this finite, imperfect being like himself couldn't have conceived of this idea of God, which is an infinite being. This clear and distinct idea that Descartes has must have come from God himself, and it is innate within Descartes, right? It is there from birth, Descartes says. He writes, "It remains for me only to ask how I received this idea from God. I didn't get it from the senses. It has never come to me unexpectedly, as do most of the ideas that occur when I seem to see and touch and hear things. And it's not something that I invented either. For clearly, I can't take anything away from it or add anything to it. When an idea is sheerly invented, the inventor is free to fiddle with it, add a bit here, subtract a bit there, whereas my idea of God is a natural unit that doesn't invite or even permit such interference. The only remaining alternative is that my idea of God is innate in me, just as the idea of myself is innate in me." So Descartes arguing here that he's got this clear and distinct idea of God, which is present from birth. It's innate. And remember that innate knowledge is a big theme in rationalism, right? We saw this with Plato. Remember, Plato has Socrates argue that at least a priori knowledge, which would come from the forms, is innate. How do you learn? Well, you don't really learn, you just recollect, right? Similarly, Descartes is saying that he has this innate, clear, and distinct idea of God. It's there from birth, and it was put there by God, because Descartes, being a finite being, couldn't conceive of something greater than himself, like God. So very much within the rationalist tradition, and indeed, this is why Descartes is not just the father of modern philosophy, but the father of rationalism in the modern European tradition. And this is very different from empiricism. Remember, empiricism, it's, the mind is a blank slate at birth, knowledge comes from the senses, very different from what Descartes is arguing here in the Meditations. But Descartes has introduced a little problem here. Descartes is actually using circular reasoning in the Meditations. He's committing a logical fallacy that we call begging the question. A lot of times you'll hear this phrase, begging the question, used incorrectly. You'll maybe hear somebody on television, or perhaps you'll be reading an article where somebody will tell you something and then say, this begs the question. Somebody might say something like, the COVID-19 numbers in Ontario are trending downward, which begs the question, when can we reopen? You might hear people say something like that, but that's actually wrong. That's not what this means. Begging the question is a particular type of informal fallacy. It's an error of reasoning. It's basically a circular argument. Why is Descartes' argument circular? He's saying, on the one hand, God exists because I have a clear and distinct idea of God. On the other hand, he's saying that God is like the guarantor of the accuracy and trustworthiness of his clear and distinct ideas. So, God exists. How do you know? Clear and distinct ideas. How can you trust your clear and distinct ideas? God. You see the circle? These two propositions support one another, but there is no independent support for either of them. It's a bit like, what's an example? Here. It's kind of like if somebody were to ask you, do you believe in God? Yes. Well, how do you know he exists? And you say, well, it says in the Bible, right? It says right here. Okay, but how do you know the Bible's true? Well, because God exists and inspired Holy Spirit, all that stuff, right? I mean, that's fine for people who believe in that sort of thing. How do you know the Bible is accurate? Well, God. How do you know God exists? The Bible. Okay, those two things mutually support one another, but there's no outside support for either of them, logically speaking. So that's circular reasoning. And by the way, I'm not using this example to be facetious here. I understand that for those who believe that can be enough. But remember, this is a philosophy class, and we need to have good reasons for everything we believe. And Descartes is committing a fallacy here, and someone's got to raise that issue. So again, this is called the Cartesian Circle, and we're not going to get into it in too much detail, but it's something to be aware of if you're reading Descartes. This is a very famous problem that he introduced, and that a lot of people caught him and called him out over back in the day. All right, so that's how Descartes addresses solipsism. How do I know other things exist and other minds exist? Well, he might have clear and distinct ideas of other minds as well, and problematic Cartesian circles aside, he believes he can trust his clear and distinct ideas. So that's at least part of Descartes' effort to answer this problem. But how do you know about the contents of other minds? Well, Descartes talks a little bit about that in the Discourses on the Method in part 5. And I just want to take a quick look at that before we go on to talk about the mind-body problem. Because as we'll see later on in the course, it's very important and foreshadows something that's really relevant when it comes to artificial intelligence. So these passages that I'm about to read come from part 5 of the Discourses on the Method. And here Descartes is talking about human bodies, animal bodies, and the difference between the mind and the body. A lot of the same things that he'll talk about in part 6 of the Meditations, actually. But anyway, I just thought I would read this because it foreshadows something really interesting, as we'll see later in the course. So here we go. Nor will this appear at all strange to those who are acquainted with the variety of movements performed by the different automata, or moving machines fabricated by human industry, and that, with help of but few pieces compared with the great multitude of bones, muscles, nerves, arteries, veins, and other parts that are found in the body of each animal. I'm going to talk a little bit more about automata when we get into Hobbes. We're probably going to talk more about automatons in the clockwork universe than we're actually going to spend talking about Hobbes. So just keep that in mind. We've mentioned automata a lot. I haven't really talked a lot about them. We will next time, okay? So, to continue. Such persons will look upon this body as a machine made by the hands of God, which is incomparably better arranged and adequate to movements more admirable than is any machine of human invention. And here I specially stayed to show that, were there such machines exactly resembling organs and outward form an ape or any other irrational animal, we could have no means of knowing that they were in any respect of a different nature from these animals. But if there were machines bearing the image of our bodies, and capable of imitating our actions as far as it is morally possible, there would still remain two most certain tests whereby to know that they were not therefore really men. So Descartes saying here, like, look, if we could make an automaton, a robot, that was physically identical to an animal and it could do all of the same behaviors as an animal, like a gorilla or a chimp, if we could make it look exactly like that and behave exactly like that, we couldn't tell the difference between a real ape and a robot ape, for example, because these animals don't have reason. We could tell a robot or an artificial human from a real human because real humans have reason. And there are two tests that Descartes is going to give us to test whether this machine is a machine made by God who has reason, or a soulless automaton. Okay, so here we go. Of these, the first is that they could never use words or other signs arranged in such a manner as is competent to us in order to declare our thoughts to others. For we may easily conceive a machine to be so constructed that it emits vocables, and even that it emits some correspondent to the action upon it of external objects which cause a change in its organs. For example, if touched in a particular place, it may demand what we wish to say to it. If in another, it may cry out that it is hurt, and such like, but not that it should arrange them variously so as appositely to reply to what is said in its presence, as men of the lowest grade of intellect can do. So one of these machines could never communicate its thought to others the way human beings can. It would be a soulless automaton, right? There's no reason. There's nothing. It's there. Nothing in there to think with. Descartes says. So, even if this automaton had real-looking skin and hair and behaved exactly like a person, and maybe, if you shook its hand, it said, "How do you do?" or if you touched its nose, it said, "Ouch." It still wouldn't be able to carry on a conversation with you, and that is how we would know it was a machine, says Descartes. To continue, the second test is that although such machines might execute many things with equal or perhaps greater perfection than any of us, they would, without doubt, fail in certain others from which it could be discovered that they did not act from knowledge, but solely from the disposition of their organs. For while reason is an universal instrument that is alike available on every occasion, these organs, on the contrary, need a particular arrangement for each particular action. Whence it must be morally impossible that there should exist in any machine a diversity of organs sufficient to enable it to act in all the occurrences of life, in the way in which our reason enables us to act. So we can respond in almost infinite different ways. Our reason gives us flexibility. This is something that Noam Chomsky will pick up on during the cognitive revolution in the 20th century. And he talks about this a lot in a book he published called Cartesian Linguistics. So Descartes wraps this up. He says, again, by means of these two tests, we may likewise know the difference between men and brutes, for it is highly deserving of remark that there are no men so dull and stupid, not even idiots, as to be incapable of joining together different words, and thereby constructing a declaration by which to make their thoughts understood. And that, on the other hand, there is no other animal, however perfect or happily circumstance, which can do the like. So this is also not just how we could tell the difference between a human and a robot, but how we can tell the difference between humans and animals. Descartes is saying animals can't put together words and communicate their thoughts like we can, and even the dumbest people, people who are deficient, cognitively speaking, can come up with some way of communicating their thoughts to others. Probably a lot of more modern thinkers, contemporary thinkers, would disagree with this, right? I mean, there's Coco the gorilla, right? There's Alex the African gray parrot. There's some very clever animals that have been argued on the basis of what they can do to reason about as well as human children can. So Descartes might be wrong about that. And also, there are people who are cognitively not dull at all, but which may not speak. For example, people on the autism spectrum can demonstrate deficiencies in language, and yet they don't show any intellectual deficiencies in other domains. So they're smart, but they're nonverbal. So again, Descartes' probably wrong about this, but I just wanted to make you aware of this interesting idea of knowing a human from a machine, because a human can communicate its thoughts with language, whereas a machine can't. This actually foreshadows something called the Turing Test, which, as we'll see when we talk about Alan Turing's work, the Turing Test is a test to see whether we can say that a computer can think. And Turing's test is pretty much the same test proposed by Descartes here. It is a test to see if the computer can carry on a human-like conversation with another human. And if the human can't tell that she's talking to a computer, if the computer holds a conversation in such a way that it convinces the human that she's talking with another human and not a computer, the computer passes the test. And we should say, according to Turing, that the computer can think. But we will talk about the Turing test later in the class when we return to the work of Alan Turing. I just wanted to make you aware of this because it's also another handy solution to the problem of other minds, right? How do we know that other minds exist and what they're like? Well, they can communicate their thoughts to us with language. That's what Descartes argued. So, having tackled the problem of other minds and the worries about solipsism, I say we wrap things up with a little discussion about the mind-body problem. So let's take a look now. So as I mentioned a little while ago, it kind of strikes me that I should talk more about this mechanistic philosophy and this clockwork universe business, since that's very much a part of what was going on when Descartes and some of his contemporaries like Thomas Hobbes and Galileo and those fellas, very much all about that time period was all about mechanistic philosophy and this idea of this clockwork universe. So I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of the lecture, though. But anyway, remember, Descartes is a dualist, a substance dualist, right? He's a mechanistic philosopher on the one hand, so he believes that the universe is like a giant clockwork mechanism and it's deterministic. And the body is like this too. It's all just cause and effect, right? So, how do you have freedom of the will in a universe like this? If everything is determined, how does freedom of the will exist? Well, Descartes addresses this with his substance dualism. The body, everything in the physical world is mechanistic. Everything behaves according to laws of nature. So everything is determined. But thinking substance is not determined. Thinking substance, remember, is immaterial, immortal. It's the soul. And so that is where we get our free will from, according to Descartes. But in making this distinction between this mechanical body, res extensa versus this thinking thing, res cogitans, unextended soul versus extended deterministic body, he introduced a problem, and that's called the mind-body problem. Let's see where this problem arises by taking a quick look at Descartes' description of the mind and body again, and this is drawn from the sixth meditation. So here we go. So in the sixth meditation, Descartes writes, "There is a great difference between the mind and the body. Whereas every body is by its nature divisible, the mind can't be divided. For when I consider the mind, or consider myself insofar as I am merely a thinking thing, I can't detect any parts within myself. I understand myself to be something single and complete. The whole mind seems to be united to the whole body, but not by a uniting of parts to parts, as the following consideration shows. If a foot or arm or any other part of the body is cut off, nothing is thereby taken away from the mind. As for the faculties of willing, of understanding, of sensory perception, and so on, these are not parts of the mind, since it is one and has the same mind that wills, and the same mind that wills, understands, and perceives. They are, I repeat, not parts of the mind, because they are properties or powers of it. By contrast, any corporeal thing can easily be divided into parts in my thought, and this shows me that it is really divisible. This one argument would be enough to show me that the mind is completely different from the body, even if I did not already know as much as from other considerations. The mind isn't immediately affected by all parts of the body, but only by the brain, or perhaps just by the small part of it, which is said to contain the common sense. The signals that reach the mind depend on what state this part of the brain is in, irrespective of the condition of the other parts of the body. There is abundant experimental evidence for this, which I needn't review here. So here Descartes is saying bodies are divisible, the mind is not. Again, a lot of contemporary thinkers would probably disagree with Descartes here. We divide the mind up nowadays into lots of different faculties. You know, you've got memory, attention, reasoning, you know, lots of different faculties. Or even if you just want to think of, like, you know, the conscious versus the unconscious, right? We can divide the mind up, no problem. So a lot of people would disagree with Descartes here. And this part of the brain that is said to contain the common sense, this is Descartes' answer to the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is, how does this indivisible, unextended thinking mind interact with this physical body? Descartes thought it happened in the pineal gland, which is a little gland in your brain. He thought that was where the soul controlled the body from, the little pilot seat of the soul, if you like. But he never really explained how that was supposed to work either. Anyway, let's hear more about the mind and body. Again, from the sixth meditation. Whenever any part of the body is moved by another part that is some distance away, it can be moved in the same fashion by any of the parts that lie in between, without the more distant part doing anything. For example, in a chord ABCD, if one end D is pulled so that the other end A moves, A could have been moved in just the same way if B or C had been pulled and D had not moved at all. Similarly, when I feel a pain in my foot, this happens by means of the nerves that run from the foot to the brain. When the nerves are pulled in the foot, they pull on inner parts of the brain and make them move. And nature has laid it down that this motion should produce in the mind a sensation of pain as though occurring in the foot. But since these nerves stretch from the foot to the brain through the calf, the thigh, the lumbar region, the back, and the neck, the same sensation of pain in the foot can come about when one of the intermediate parts is pulled, even if nothing happens in the foot. This presumably holds for any other sensation. The reason I wanted to read this part to you, because it really shows the mechanistic view of the body that Descartes held. You know, he's talking about nerves as if they're strings being pulled which move parts of the brain. Of course, this isn't really how nerves work, but it gives you an idea of, you know, thinking of the body as a mechanism, right? Anyway, Descartes continues. One kind of movement in the part of the brain that immediately affects the mind always produces just one kind of sensation, and it would be best for us if it were always the kind that would contribute the most to keeping us alive and well. Experience shows that the sensations that nature has given us are all of just such kinds, so everything about them bears witness to the power and goodness of God. For example, when the nerves in the foot are set in motion in a violent and unusual manner, this motion reaches the inner part of the brain via the spinal cord and gives the mind its signal for having a sensation of pain as occurring in the foot. This stimulates the mind to do its best to remove the cause of the pain, which it takes to be harmful to the foot. God could have made our nature such that this motion in the brain indicated something else to the mind. For example, making the mind aware of the actual motion occurring in the brain or the foot or in any of the intermediate regions. But nothing else would have been so conducive to the continued well-being of the body. In the same way, when we need a drink or a certain dryness, in the same way, when we need a drink, a certain dryness arises in the throat, and this moves the nerves of the throat, which in turn move the inner parts of the brain. That produces in the mind a sensation of thirst, because the most useful thing for us to know at this point is that we need drink in order to stay healthy. Similarly in other cases. So Descartes is talking again about the body working in this mechanistic way. The mind does not work this way. The body affects the nerves which affect the brain for Descartes. The brain is part of the body, but the brain is not where the mind is. The mind is the soul, and the soul is immaterial, right? So Descartes has introduced the mind-body problem here. He's got his certain foundations for knowledge, right? He can be certain that he exists, he's a thinking thing, and he's got some clear and distinct ideas, and as long as clear and distinct ideas exist in the understanding, they're reliable. So he's building up his epistemic foundations, but he's introduced a metaphysical problem. So with this epistemic problem that he's solved, he's introduced a metaphysical problem. How does the mind, which is the thinking substance, interact with the body, which is made of matter, which is extended, which does not think? How does that happen? Again, Descartes thought that it happened in the pineal gland, that area of the brain where common sense was said to reside. Common sense is an idea that comes down to us from Aristotle. It doesn't mean what it means when we say common sense in the colloquial sense today. It means like your ability to think and use your mind and stuff. So Descartes thinks this happens in the pineal gland, but he doesn't exactly explain how that is supposed to work. And we still grapple with this problem today. For example, in the form of the hard problem of consciousness, which is, how does this material brain I've got that's made of neurons give rise to this subjective experience of everything? The brightness of the lamp, the pinky, orangey fluorescence of my guitar, right? How does all this subjective experience arise from physical matter? That's like the hard problem of consciousness, okay? Now, real quick, there are a couple of contemporary responses to the mind-body problem. One was offered by Baruch Spinoza, who was another rationalist philosopher, and Spinoza was a pantheist. Descartes is really more of a deist. A deist is someone who believes in God, and that God is like a watchmaker God. This God, the deistic God, creates the universe and then just kind of steps back and lets the universe run. The universe, again, is like a clockwork mechanism, right? And God is like the watchmaker. So Descartes' a deist or maybe a theist. A theist is someone who believes God takes an active role in the universe. You know, probably most Christians and Muslims and Jews are theists, for example. Spinoza is a pantheist, which means he thinks that God is just everything. God or nature is the famous pantheist dictum. So Spinoza is a pantheist. God is the entire universe and everything in it. So how does Spinoza solve the mind-body problem? Well, he says that mind and matter are not really two different substances. Rather, thinking and extension are two different attributes of the same substance. There's only one substance for Spinoza, remember, that's God. And thinking and extension are just attributes that that substance has. So, according to Spinoza, again, pantheist, God is a single substance. It's the only substance that exists. God is everything that exists, and it has infinite attributes. Minds are just finite modifications of God under the attribute of thought, and bodies are finite modifications of God under the attribute of extension. So there is no mind-body problem for Spinoza. There's no interaction between different substances because mind and matter are different attributes of the same substance, which is God. But this got Spinoza into a little bit of trouble, right? You can probably see why. If you're a pantheist like Spinoza and you're saying, well, we're all just finite modifications of God, well, that implies that you're God, which is heresy. That implies that I'm God, which is heresy. It implies that God has a body, which was heresy. So Spinoza was labeled a heretic. And, similar to how Descartes had to do a lot of his work in the Netherlands, and he still feared persecution. Many of his works were banned by the Catholic Church, and he withheld publication on some of his works because of what happened to thinkers like Galileo. Spinoza was also excommunicated from his community. Spinoza was a Jewish philosopher. He was excommunicated from the Jewish community in Amsterdam, and he finally settled in The Hague. And just kind of lived out his life doing philosophy and polishing and grinding lenses. He was a glass worker. He made lenses for instruments and spectacles and spyglasses and this kind of thing. So Spinoza's a pantheist, and he says, well, there's no interaction problem because there's only one substance, right? It's just God. And minds and bodies are just different attributes of God. Mind, or rather, mind and extension are different attributes of God, and individual minds and individual bodies are finite modifications of God under those attributes. Another response comes from Gottfried Leibniz. Leibniz is actually the co-inventor or co-discoverer of calculus, along with Isaac Newton. And Leibniz also reduces everything to just one substance. He calls this substance the monad, or monads. Monads are like unextended teleological active substances that make up everything. Minds are made of monads, according to Leibniz. The body is a collection of monads, and God, of course, is like the monad of monads, or all of the monads together. You might be tempted to think of monads like atoms or subatomic particles. They're not quite like that. They're not like atoms in the modern sense, nor in the ancient sense. They're not like Democritus's atoms either. They're more like zones of force, or maybe if you're familiar with virtual particles in quantum theory, they're really something more like that. In any case, everything is made out of monads, according to Leibniz, and although they're all intrinsically related to one another, they don't actually interact. There's no cause and effect. It's not like these monads are little particles bumping into each other and causing things and being affected by things and so on and so forth. No, Leibniz actually thought that it all just appears this way because of a pre-established harmony. Leibniz thinks that God sets up this pre-established harmony between all of the monads at the moment of creation. So there's no actual interaction once again, because the monads are not really interacting with one another. There's no cause and effect. It's just everything happening when it needs to happen, because that's how God has decreed that the universe will unfold. It sounds very weird, very strange. It solves the mind-body problem because there's no interaction, but now there's also no free will because it's all pre-established harmony. So we're kind of back to the problem Descartes wanted to solve, like free will in a deterministic universe. So, too bad, Leibniz. So Spinoza and Leibniz each appealed to a kind of substance monism to respond to the mind-body problem. And you'll remember substance monism from my discussion of the pre-Socratics, right? Remember Thales, who thought that the arche, or primordial substance, was water. And there were other Greek thinkers who were substance monists who believed that the primordial substance was air, or change itself, or numbers. There were substance pluralists like Empedocles that thought that everything was made out of earth, air, fire, and water, right? Descartes, as we've seen, was a dualist. He thinks there are two substances: matter, extended things, bodies, res extensa, and thinking substance, mind, the soul, res cogitans. Leibniz and Spinoza say, no, there's only one substance. Leibniz says it's monads. Spinoza says it's God. And that's how they solve the mind-body problem. The contemporary answer to this problem might involve another kind of substance monism, like physicalism or materialism. These words refer to the same thing, by the way. They refer to the metaphysical view that the only things that exist are physical or material things. In other words, matter and energy and the properties of things made of matter, or things that involve energy, right? So those are the only things that exist. So on this view, what is the mind? The mind is perhaps just the brain. Mental states, conscious ones, reasoning through a problem, emotions, whatever mental state you could think of is identical to a brain state. That's identity theory. Or maybe the mind is just the thing that the brain does. Maybe we can have a functionalist understanding. But there's no special extra substance. There must be, according to physicalism or materialism, a physical explanation for, things like my subjective conscious experience, like my experience of this lamp, or the color of this guitar, or the taste of my coffee here. Now, we're going to get into this prospect a little bit more as we continue throughout the course. It does have some disturbing implications, potentially, depending on what your beliefs about the nature of reality are, right? I mean, if everything is just physical, that seems to imply determinism, right? So what happens for free will? What about consciousness? It doesn't seem like we can explain the subjective quality of my experience by appealing to objective, physical laws, for example. But maybe that's how it is, and maybe this isn't really a problem. Maybe the hard problem isn't really that hard. Maybe you can think of some interesting implications that this would have to how you think about the mind, how you think about free will and the self and God, if you believe in God. This may have some interesting implications for you, and I'm not trying to pressure you into changing any fundamental beliefs, but it would be interesting to hear what you think about, what that would mean if we live in a completely physical, determined universe. What would that mean for explaining consciousness or free will or anything like that? I'd love to hear about it. Well, I think that's all for Descartes' philosophy. Next time we're going to look at another thinker from the modern period. We're going to look at the work of Thomas Hobbes, who was a mechanistic philosopher like Descartes. But he's not a dualist. He presents a kind of mechanical account of the mind. And as I mentioned earlier, I think I need to talk a little bit more about this clockwork universe business. I don't think I've really emphasized that enough thus far. So I'd like you to please begin reading Hobbes's Leviathan. I would just read the introduction and chapters 1 and 2 for now. I might have you read chapter 3 for the next class, but we're not going to go too far into Thomas Hobbes. Instead, for the next couple lectures, I'll be talking about Hobbes' mechanistic philosophy, but I'll also fill you in on this clockwork universe, deterministic, mechanistic philosophical account of the cosmos. So I'll talk a lot about that, and I'll probably just draw examples from Hobbes to kind of highlight this kind of thinking. But that's what we'll do for next time. So definitely read the introduction and get started on chapters 1 and 2 in Leviathan. They're not that long. Link is in the slides and also on See You Learn. And that's it for today. So if you have any questions, let me know. Reach out. I'd love to hear if any of you are stuck on the material. Of course, the discussion forums for week 4 are up now. So if you have a question or an interesting insight to offer, that is the place to do it, because that is how you will get your participation marks. But I also welcome YouTube comments, emails, Discord server, lots of ways to get in touch with me. So again, that's all for today. That's all for Descartes. Next time, we'll look at Hobbes and talk a little bit more about mechanistic philosophy and this idea of this clockwork universe. All right. I'll see you guys next time. Bye for now.